Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode. It's time for yet another story. This is from our friend River, who I'm so happy. I haven't seen a story of hers in a while. I'm really happy that she sent one in. This is a story called Close to Home. Hello, sweethearts. Moon, Sango, and all of you beautiful people never cease to give me happiness every day. It's been a while since I wrote a story, and it's been one that I've been sitting on. I actually spoke to Moon about this a little in person, some of which would not be suitable for a YouTube video to begin with, and some of which would directly lead to my family, so you understand that I must be very careful when telling this story. Before I begin, Moon was kind enough to help me with this one. He read over it and we talked about some things that have lingered from this situation. Things that I think I'm going to leave out of this story. And he has graciously given me advice, which I've been taking time with. Thank you, and I hope you know that I've listened to you, and I'm very grateful. I'm hoping that whatever little help I give actually does help. It means a lot to me. A trigger warning to all those who are sensitive to highly manipulative persons and those who might get a sense, based on what I've written here, of what I've left out. This begins with a very, very young and impressionable River who is mostly a witness to the events to follow. I'm trying to keep my tone very matter-of-fact as it's intended to make a few points. This aunt of mine who I'll be talking about was my mother's oldest sister. She and my grandmother played a big role in developing my love of cooking and baking, and they were generally great influence on my life in other ways as well. My aunt, unlike other members of my family, was very frivolous. She worked, but didn't want to be independent, and through some unremarkable course of events, she met Neil. Now, Neil was very charismatic, but automatically not someone I think I ever would have accepted as an uncle. He won the favor of most of the family right away, but I'm more reserved and anxious. This, unfortunately, would make me the child that needed to be won over. He took me with two other girls who I think were his nieces to a children's museum a few hours' drive away. Keep in mind, I'm separated from my parents and from everyone who knew me well. I remember there were these model planes, but everything else is a bit spotty. The reason why this is pertinent is because of its purpose, to win me over so I could tell the rest of my family what a great guy he is. Neil had a small company that would do contract construction work. He made a lot of money from it, and presumably, as a personal favor, he and other people in his company did some work on my grandmother's kitchen. It was a minor tiling job, but the act of it helped him to establish his footing in my family. He'd also buy my aunt expensive purses, things like that, and she interpreted that as love language. Here's the thing. He hadn't won me over. He thought it'd be funny, blocked me from going back to my safe place in the living room out of my grandmother's house, where I sleep, and he'd try to make me give him a hug. At some points, he wasn't just joking, and I haven't come forward to my family about the extent of that. So this is actually a common occurrence among family members and seen as very minor, but forcing a child to hug someone, even if they're family, literally whoever they are, can be an implicit lesson about their own body autonomy. This sounds extreme, but I'm not exaggerating. As an anxious child with a lot of general reservations around new people, I was forced to hug many unfamiliar people to me, even if I didn't want to. But I didn't think through the effects of that until years later. Something else he would do is call to little me from across the room to fill his water cup at the refrigerator. It seems innocent enough favor to ask, yell, at a child, around a lot of my family who would watch me do it for some reason, when he's at a chair a few feet from the refrigerator. I don't really have an explanation for that one. It was just weird and nobody ever said anything about it. Not even my parents or my aunt ever said a word against him at this point. I'd formed a different impression of my aunt and questioned her choices, but wasn't taught to voice my concerns. That would have been rude and invasive, and probably wouldn't have been taken seriously. My grandfather unfortunately passed after a long period of time when a kind nurse had to come visit him daily. He needed a hospital bed in his house. To date this, I'd have been in middle school, so maybe around 12 years ago. The funeral was fairly elaborate and Neil was there. When it came time for family members to speak, My aunt struggled, but eventually did. It was unprepared. My mother didn't feel like she could, but Neil got up and he took a piece of lined paper from his pocket and unfolded it. It was about his relationship to my grandfather and how much my grandfather supposedly liked him. Those moments of retelling times, making cinnamon rolls with my aunt and my grandfather standing by and adding extra cinnamon when they weren't looking, my grandmother scolding him for it and swearing when his favorite baseball team made any kind of mistake, stories from when he served, stories from when my grandparents were young and dating, all stories that were told and retold by everyone. It led to this. There was no aftermath to speak of. I don't think anyone had the energy for it, not even my firecracker mother, his next target. He called my house after my parents and I made the drive back to our home a state away. Mom answered, and the whole conversation was insistence that she'd been talking about him and spreading things. That conversation was what really made my parents see his true colors. When they found out he had been tricking my grandmother into giving him money and that he'd been extremely underhanded in more ways than that, generally my parents started seeing him for how he really was. Neil would gradually lose the blind support system that he had built through my family, but my aunt, well, she loved him. The first Thanksgiving after one of my second cousins was born was a big one. It was the first time my parents and I had seen Neil in a really long time, but I don't remember how long. I do know that I was 16. I said my mother was a firecracker, and I meant it. I was watching the baby, and Mom was watching Neil be Neil, all gregarious and happy. Then he approached me and tried to make conversation. Mom knew she was going to blow up as soon as he got near me, so, shaking, she went to wash dishes for my grandmother. I gave him brief replies to his questions, not giving too much away, but still saying enough. To be fair, I was holding a baby, and even he knew he couldn't pull anything with me while I had her. He made his way back to the crowd of my family, and as soon as he was back in my mom's line of sight, she snapped. Again, she knows more about the kinds of manipulative things he's done than I've told. I'm not good with yelling, so I went to what was my safe place and stayed there with my dad. The baby went outside with her mother. This would lead to an intervention specifically for my aunt, who still loved Neil and was living with him and depending on him. So the last trick that Neil tried to pull was by changing the locks and keys to my grandmother's house. My cousin, father of the aforementioned baby, responded to this by angrily changing the locks again and withholding the key from Neil. My grandmother hardly ever left the house, agoraphobia. Clearly this wasn't about keeping people in. More things about Neil came to light as the days went on, and finally most of my family was trying to get my aunt to leave him. So the story ends with him leaving her, taking the car that he bought, and eventually getting arrested for not paying his workers, leaving major jobs partially done, and taking the money, etc. I was in college by this time, but if you're following the progression of time here, not only was his arrest published in the news, but there's a YouTube channel with videos specifically about him warning people against him. I'd link it in this post, but I don't want this getting traced to my family, so upon Moon's request, I can privately send the link to him, to the articles about him and videos for more information is needed or wanted. I haven't really talked about this to a lot of people, but throughout the progression of this and looking back on it, a lot of my personal anxieties have stemmed from it. I came to eventually learn those anxieties are valid, learn that having a good intuition and being a good judge of character is important, and not to just dismiss red flags, to at least remember them if anything. These are examples of things that I can't just learn and move on, but I have to reinforce them and keep learning them. Moon, I hope you know that I'd never trust anyone else to handle this story, so do as you will. If you think parts of our conversation, especially the advice you gave, works here, please don't hesitate to impart. It's scattered, and there are things that I purposely left out, but I hope those reading and listening will understand why this needs to be told. I'm scared, and I'm not a strong person. I'm just not, and I'm sorry for that, but I can't let that keep me silent anymore. Here's hoping he and others like him go away for good. As a final note, I love you all so very much. I can't thank all of you enough for the family that you are to me, and all you give to me and to each other every day. It's my honor to be around such beautiful souls. Moon, you don't give yourself enough credit. Your friend, River. So, yeah, I remember discussing this with River in private, because there were a lot of things that kind of came up when responding to this, and talking about how this affected, you know, their life, and like how this impacted everything. And there's a lot of that when it comes to a lot of really negative situations. I mean, first off, my opinion on this guy is he's a fucking jerk, and yeah. The other thing that, if kind of going through this in a kind of sort of order, that really stuck with me is the idea of when people make their kids like be affectionate for someone who they don't really know or they're not comfortable with. Don't fucking do that. Just do not do that. That is really not cool, and you wouldn't do that to an adult. So it's not okay for you to do that to a child. I mean, that should go without saying, but some people still think that that's okay. It's not. It's really not. It can make you feel like you don't, have control over yourself. I had to go through similar things like that when I was younger, too. Like, you have to do this, you have to do that, and it's like, it just makes you super uncomfortable, and you don't like it, There's also a very specific piece of a conversation that we had, and I won't go into specific details, but I feel like this is a kind of lesson that really should be talked about a little. One of the things that Rivers said was that it was worrisome that through all this and reacting to this, the question was, whether or not you are the person you are, or if you're just the things you respond to. And the way I kind of explained it is, no matter what your response is, it's your response. I've had a lot of people who were worried about like the traumas and things that they went through when they were much younger, or, just generally traumas that happened in the past. It's difficult to put into words, but I think the best kind of way I've ever heard someone put it is something my mom said. So, a little brief history on this. My mom was one of the only detectives in the domestic violence task force when she was with the police department. And one of the things that she would specifically tell people after they've been through, some horrible trauma like this, like the thing that's happened to them, is the general consensus of something bad happening is the person in question will immediately, ask, why did this happen to me? What did I do? And the answer is, you didn't do anything. These things just happen, and it's not your fault. And with the same question of, I went through these things, does that change who I am? And the answer is no. That does not change who you are. You are who you are regardless of what happened. Only you can choose to be who you are, and no one can ever take that away from you. Ever. They can act horrible, they can do horrible things, they can try, but they will fail. And this applies to everybody. You can learn from trauma, you can learn from past mistakes, but it does not define you. You are not a product of these things. You are a survivor of these things. There is a difference. It's really difficult to kind of put into words, but it's a similar thing. I went through some really horrible shit with some of my exes. They were incredibly manipulative, and honestly, looking back on it, in many cases abusive. But unlike this, this thing that we keep getting told about, like, what you're supposed to do, it's like, you just need to forgive and move on. It's like, you do not need to forgive. Forgiveness is not always a step in finding closure. It's not always a step in moving on. It works for some people, not for all people. I don't forgive them for what they did. I probably never will. But the one thing that brings me closure and happiness is that I know that I'll never see them again. I know that I'm never going to speak to them again. And I know that what they did, though horrible, does not define me as who I am. If their terrible actions are what shaped me into being a person, I would not be doing these things right now. I wouldn't be talking about it. Because one of the main things was never to have emotion and never to talk. Well, I have emotion, and I will talk. And I won't be shut up, and I won't be shut down. Actions speak louder than words is that old saying, but someone else's actions don't define you. Your actions define you. And only you can determine what those are. And again, no one can ever take that away from you. This guy sounds like a manipulative jerk, and he sounds like the kind of person who would pull that kind of shit. Who would try to, like, you know, make someone do things for him specifically to prove some sort of authority. To prove some sort of, like, dominance. But that's bullshit. I'm sure in his mind, and to a much younger person, this seemed like a very authoritative and almost dominant move. But myself as an adult, reading the actions of another adult, he seems like an immature fucking moron. These are the actions of an asshole. And they don't define you, and they don't reflect anything that you are. He is an asshole, and you're better than that. End of story. This one got a little heated near the end, and I am sorry about that. I don't know where some of these stories will take me sometimes, but I am always glad that we get to have conversations about some things, and I want you guys always to know that you matter no matter what. And if anyone, you know, tries to tell you that you don't, fuck them, they're an idiot. You matter. And if they have some kind of problem with you defending yourself and saying you matter, you always have that wonderful, perfect ace in the hole. Remember, you matter. And if they don't believe you matter, well, they're not a magical unicorn from the moon, now are they? I am, and I say you matter. So fuck them. Magical unicorn beats all other cards. Just fucking basic science. Everybody knows that. And I love you, baby. So I'll see you guys in the next video. I hope you have a wonderful whatever time of day it is. And remember, you're awesome. Period. Okay, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.